In early 1916, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Nissen surveyed the muddy work sites near EPI, his mind far from architectural matters. He witnessed British soldiers dying from exposure as they waited for adequate shelter. The Western Front had destroyed conventional building approaches. Wood was in short supply, skilled builders were fighting in trenches, and every building had to survive bombardment. Nissen, a Canadian-born mining engineer serving with the Royal Engineers, had spent months watching corrugated iron sheets sit unused near supply stations because no one understood their potential. These curved metal panels, initially designed for roofs, accumulated while soldiers froze in canvas tents that crumbled under snowfall. The brilliance of Nissen's answer wasn't its sophistication, it was its stark simplicity. He took these corrugated sheets and curved them into a semicircle, forming a building that needed no interior supports and could be placed straight on the ground. In March 1919, he constructed the first model at Ypres, using only standard-issue equipment and 6 soldiers who'd never constructed anything previously. The building was up in under 4 hours. When Nissen showed his design to British Army Command, he made one guarantee that transformed everything. Any foot soldier with basic directions could construct it in 3 days, and the components could be moved on a single truck. The British Army validated the approach right away at Richborough Port, where the 172nd Tunneling Company built 20 huts in April 1916. Each hut measured 16 feet wide and used roughly 600 square feet of corrugated steel. The curved shape meant rainfall and shrapnel slid away instead of piercing through, and the absence of straight walls removed weak spots where shells could catch and rip. By June 1916, Nissen huts were spreading throughout every British zone of the Western Front. The War Office issued its first enormous order in August, 10,000 units to be produced and delivered before winter. What made the Nissen hut groundbreaking wasn't merely velocity. It was removing skilled labor from the process. Conventional military building required carpenters, stonemasons, and engineers. Nissen's approach required none of this. The corrugated sheets arrived pre-drilled with holes positioned exactly 14 inches apart. Wooden end sections arrived as ready-made panels. The base was discretionary. Teams could fasten the hut straight to wooden beams or even to compressed earth when needed. A sergeant and 5 privates could offload the components, arrange the foundation, and have the building weatherproof before sunset. During the Battle of the Somme in late 1916, building teams were raising Nissen huts within artillery distance, supplying instant shelter for injured soldiers being removed from the battle lines. The hut's measurements were determined for peak efficiency. The 16-foot width permitted 2 rows of beds with a middle walkway, accommodating 30 soldiers comfortably or 50 during emergencies. The curved ceiling, reaching roughly 15 feet at its highest point, offered enough vertical room that soldiers could stand upright throughout most of the space. Air circulation came from adjustable sections at both ends, and the corrugated steel's inherent air spaces prevented the moisture issues that troubled canvas tents. By the ceasefire in November 1918, British troops had installed over 100,000 Nissen huts throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. They functioned as sleeping quarters, medical facilities, storage centers, and headquarters, wherever the military required immediate infrastructure. The design papers Nissen provided to the War Office in April 1916 explained why his hut surpassed every competitor. Conventional military buildings depended on vertical frameworks, posts, cross beams, and supports that had to be measured, adjusted, and connected with accuracy. Nissen removed the whole idea of frameworks. His curved, corrugated sheets were load-bearing, meaning the sides and ceiling were identical elements. When you fastened one sheet to another, you weren't simply adding surface area, you were building structural strength. Each 16-foot section overlapped the preceding one by 3 inches, and the fasteners passed through 3 metal layers, forming a continuous covering that spread weight and pressure throughout the entire surface. The assembly order was deliberately mistake-proof. Step 1. Position wooden foundation boards in a rectangular pattern. Step 2. Secure vertical wooden supports to these boards at 7-foot spacing. Step 3. Connect the first corrugated sheet to the supports and fasten it to the foundation. Step 4. Add the following sheet, overlapping and securing it to the previous one. Continue until the semicircle was finished. Step 5. Mount the wooden end sections, which arrived with doors and window openings already installed. Total construction duration with a trained team, 72 hours. With completely inexperienced soldiers, 4 to 5 days. The British Army verified this constantly at training facilities in Dover and Southampton during summer 1916, measuring various units to create dependable deployment timelines. What distinguished the Nissen from subsequent copies was its connection with accessible materials. Nissen designed around what Britain could realistically manufacture during wartime situations. The corrugated steel sheets were 26 gauge, substantial enough to withstand damage, yet light enough that 3 soldiers could transport a section without mechanical help. The curve measurement was carefully calculated so that ordinary sheet metal machines at British workshops could create the profile without modifications. Every fastener was 7/16 inch diameter, identical to the size used in maritime construction, meaning supply networks didn't require specialized stock. The wooden parts, end sections, foundation, boards, and interior supports came from whatever lumber was obtainable. Nissen's guidelines permitted pine, oak, or even recovered wood from demolished structures. Field versatility made the design nearly universal. In Mesopotamia during 1917, British troops constructed Nissen huts without the wooden end sections, instead utilizing bricks salvaged from destroyed settlements. In Egypt, construction teams placed the foundations directly on sand and used interior supports cut from native palm trees rather than processed lumber. The essential concept stayed constant. Those curved, corrugated sheets would create a waterproof shell, whatever you did with the remainder. A Canadian team at Vimy Ridge in March 1917 built a Nissen hut during ongoing shelling, operating in 30-minute intervals between artillery strikes. The building was functional within 18 hours, instantly sheltering 40 wounded soldiers removed from the Ridge attack. The speed benefit became most apparent in supply operations. A single railway cargo car could carry enough components for 8 complete Nissen huts, 48 sheets of corrugated steel, wooden parts, and fastening equipment. At the military installation in France, building teams sustained a record tempo throughout 1917, one finished hut every 6 hours when operating in shifts. By October 1917, this camp had expanded to hold 100,000 soldiers, almost completely housed in Nissen buildings. The camp's medical area alone held 300 huts, offering bed capacity for 12,000 patients. When the German spring attack struck in March 1918, and suddenly 20,000 extra wounded required shelter, teams built 70 new medical huts in 11 days. The United States Navy dispatched its first engineering review group to Britain in September 1940, 15 months before Pearl Harbor. Commander George F. Doriot, assigned at the Bureau of Yards and Docks in Washington, had clear instructions: examine British temporary building techniques and assess if they could sustain American military growth. Doriot invested 6 weeks visiting RAF installations, Army facilities, and Royal Navy locations throughout England and Scotland. His confidential report, submitted in November 1940, dedicated 18 pages to the Nissen hut. He recorded construction durations, material details, and spoke with British building officers who'd used them since 1916. Doriot's assessment was straightforward. The Nissen hut was the quickest field building ever created, but American troops would require changes. The changes started right after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The Navy's Civil Engineering Corps selected Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island as the testing location because it had ongoing building projects and direct railway connection for transporting prototypes. Commander John Barney Cyrus headed the planning group, working with details Doriot had obtained from Britain. Along with genuine Nissen hut drawings, the British administration supplied through Lend-Lease agreements. The first American model appeared in February 1942, and it resembled the Nissen, but contained essential differences that would influence every unit produced afterward. American engineers altered the construction principle. Where Nissen used corrugated sheets as load-bearing components fastened directly together, the Quonset design added an interior steel skeleton. This skeleton comprised curved steel arches, basically supports made from shaped steel channels that stood on their own and held the corrugated sections. The sections no longer bore structural weight. They were covering attached to the skeleton with self-drilling screws instead of through bolts. Cyrus maintained this method would produce sturdier structures capable of bearing heavier equipment loads and offering better mounting locations for power and water systems. He was right on both points, but he'd added a complication the Nissen purposely avoided. The skeleton requirement meant Quonset huts reached deployment locations as additional parts needing additional construction stages. A standard 40-foot Quonset required 14 steel arch supports, each weighing roughly 90 pounds, arranged at particular intervals and fastened to base plates. Only after the skeleton was complete could teams attach the corrugated sections. Nissen construction began with the sections themselves and developed outward. This philosophical contrast, skeleton first versus sections first, added between 12 and 18 hours to building time, according to trials performed at Quonset Point in March 1942. Navy leadership accepted the compromise because they valued building durability over construction velocity. American planning philosophy presumed most installations would be used for years, not weeks. The Quonset also integrated elements missing from the Nissen plan. Interior insulation became routine. Blankets of fiberglass placed between the steel sections and interior plywood covering. Power wiring was built into the skeleton during construction, rather than mounted on surfaces later. Wooden floors substituted the Nissen's compacted dirt or wooden platforms. Windows were bigger and featured screens. Doors used American standard equipment instead of British connectors and fasteners. Each enhancement made sense from a convenience and utility perspective, and each increased weight, parts, and construction duration. A complete Quonset hut package weighed roughly 30% more than comparable Nissen components, needing more vehicles or rail transport. By May 1942, the Navy had established 3 Quonset dimensions: 20 feet wide, 40 feet wide, and the biggest at 50 feet wide. Manufacturing agreements went to the George A. Fuller Company and the Strand Steel Corporation, both skilled with pre-assembled steel building. The first mass-manufactured units delivered to naval bases in June 1942. The steel skeleton that characterized the Quonset generated a component dependency the Nissen never experienced. Each arch support arrived as a pre-shaped piece of steel channel bent to the exact curve required for that specific hut dimension. If one support was harmed during transport, bent, fractured, or lacking fastener holes, the whole skeleton's geometry could collapse. Nissen huts accepted imperfection because the corrugated sections flexed and compensated as teams fastened them together. The sections themselves fixed minor positioning mistakes. Quonset supports had to align flawlessly before any outer sections went on, which meant building teams spent hours using levels, vertical guides, and measuring tools to guarantee every support stood at precisely 90 degrees to the base and matched the spacing patterns. The fastener total revealed the tale of rising complexity. A 16-foot Nissen hut used roughly 200 fasteners total, mainly linking corrugated sections to one another and to the wooden foundation. A 40-foot Quonset hut needed over 700 fasteners and screws. 14 arch supports fastened to base plates used 6 fasteners each, totaling 84. Diagonal bracing between supports added another 100 fasteners. Connecting corrugated sections to the skeleton with self-drilling screws meant 16 screws per section, and a 40-foot Quonset used approximately 30 sections. Then came the interior operations: plywood covering attached to the supports, insulation fixings, power box mountings, and floor supports fastened to the base. Every extra fastener was another chance for building delays when equipment failed or hardware disappeared in the field. American manufacturing approaches stressed standardization that ironically decreased field adaptability. Quonset parts were built to precise measurements in domestic workshops, which guaranteed pieces connected perfectly under managed situations. But war zones weren't managed situations. When the 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion reached Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in January 1943, they found that moisture had corroded some steel supports at fastener holes during the Pacific voyage. The supports couldn't be adjusted or substituted with native materials because the whole building relied on those accurately shaped arches. The engineers had to wait 3 weeks for substitute supports to come from Pearl Harbor, while soldiers slept in tents. The insulation arrangement, while delivering better comfort, became a building obstacle. Quonset guidelines demanded fiberglass padding to be placed between the corrugated outside and interior plywood covering. This meant teams had to operate in 3 phases: build the skeleton, attach outer sections, then return inside to place insulation and interior walls. Nissen huts were single-phase building. Once the corrugated sections were up, the building was finished and livable. Interior enhancements came afterward if time and components permitted. At the Navy's Camp Endicott in Davisville, Rhode Island, where CB battalions practiced in 1943, teachers measured both approaches. A skilled team could finish a Nissen-style hut in 48 hours. The identical team required 9 to 6 hours for a similar Quonset with complete insulation and interior completion. Power integration introduced another dimension of advanced planning that delayed field construction. Quonset huts arrived with wiring channels integrated into the skeleton, which meant electricians had to operate alongside building teams rather than after the building was finished. At naval air bases with plentiful electrical workers, this simultaneous building functioned smoothly. But in forward war zones, with restricted personnel, having electricians working on-site while construction teams were still securing supports together produced scheduling problems. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion in the Solomon Islands stated in April 1943 that power needs postponed average Quonset completion by 2 complete days because trained electricians were moving between various building locations. The floor arrangement represented arguably the most substantial velocity cost. Nissen huts had no integrated floors. Soldiers placed wooden platforms or laid concrete after the building was up. Quonset guidelines demanded pressure-treated floor supports, plywood underfloor, and completed wood flooring, all placed during original building. This maintained the interior clean and comfortable, but introduced an entire stage of woodwork. When Major General George Patton's Western Force landed near Casablanca on November 8, 1942, his supply commanders carried instructions for instant camp building to accommodate 35,000 soldiers. The landing strategy designated space for Quonset huts transported from Virginia, but war situations forced field leaders to perform estimates the Navy hadn't verified at Quonset Point. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Thompson, leading the 16th Engineer Battalion, observed his teams struggle with the steel skeleton in sand that wouldn't secure anchor fasteners. The base plates, intended for solid ground or concrete foundations, twisted when tightened because Moroccan coastal sand compressed irregularly. Thompson's post-action statement, submitted in December 1942, indicated his teams required 4 days per Quonset hut, with most time wasted stabilizing bases and adjusting skeleton supports to offset uneven settlement. British troops at the identical North African operation were simultaneously installing Nissen huts they'd transported from Alexandria. The 512th Specialist Team Royal Engineers established a field medical center outside Algiers beginning November 12, 1942. Operating with native Algerian workers who spoke limited English, the group finished 16 Nissen huts in 9 days. Their method removed bases completely. They positioned railway ties straight on leveled sand, secured the corrugated sections to those ties, and anchored everything with sand mounds piled against the outside foundation. When windstorms arrived in late November, several Quonset huts under building collapsed because their skeletons weren't yet covered with sections. The Nissen buildings, already finished with their load-bearing shells, remained upright. The Pacific Theater revealed even sharper contrasts on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division started getting Quonset huts in February 1943 after months of combat in waterlogged tent camps. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Leckie, whose account recorded the operation, described observing building teams operate in 100-degree heat with 80% moisture. The steel skeleton parts were too heated to touch with unprotected hands by mid-morning. Teams operated shortened shifts, sunrise until 10, then evening until darkness, which extended 5-day building projections into 2-week actualities. Meanwhile, Australian troops supporting missions from Port Moresby utilized Nissen pattern huts built in Sydney. Australian war manufacturing files show these streamlined versions removed even the wooden end sections using corrugated steel throughout. And building groups reported typical construction durations of 36 hours. Timing mattered most during quick base growth. When Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the establishment of Funafuti Atoll in the Ellis Islands during March 1943, Navy strategists required accommodation for 5,000 personnel within 60 days. The 2nd Naval Construction Battalion came with both Quonset components and some British Nissen huts obtained through Commonwealth supply networks. Battalion leader, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Blunden, divided his teams to compare both approaches under matching Coral Atoll situations. His formal statement in May 1943 offered precise numbers. Nissen huts averaged 54 hours from initial base timber to finished building. Quonset huts averaged 91 hours, with the difference credited mainly to skeleton positioning and interior completion demands. The velocity gap became vital during crisis expansions. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Navy required immediate medical space at Pearl Harbor for arriving wounded. The current medical facility couldn't handle the overflow, so building battalions constructed temporary ward structures next to the primary building. Using Quonset huts with their mandated bases, skeletons, and interior arrangements would have required a 2-week building schedule. Instead, teams used a combined strategy. Nissen-style corrugated shells built in 3 days with interior medical gear placed later. Those crisis wards stayed operational through 1944, accommodating over 2,000 patients during their service span. Weather protection showed unexpected compromises. Quonset insulation maintained interiors comfortable in severe heat and cold, but the intricate wall construction formed moisture pockets. In the Aleutian Islands during 1943, where mist and precipitation were perpetual, insulated Quonset huts created condensation between the outside steel and interior plywood, causing rust and fungus. Nissen huts, with their single-layer building and organic ventilation through corrugation spaces, stayed drier despite being less comfortable. American manufacturing capability converted the Quonset into a mass manufacturing marvel that the handmade Nissen could never equal. By July 1943, the Strand Steel Corporation's workshop in Richmond, Indiana, was manufacturing 200 complete Quonset hut packages daily, delivering them to both coasts for Pacific and European installation. The George A. Fuller Company's facility in Pennsylvania contributed another 150 units per day. This manufacturing quantity, over 100,000 huts yearly, demanded standardization so strict that every part had to be compatible across all units. A steel support built in January 1943 had to align perfectly with sections and equipment produced in August 1944. American workshops accomplished this accuracy through die shaping and fixture-based manufacturing that the British small-scale method to Nissen production never pursued. The standardization concept reached beyond just physical measurements. Quonset huts came in precisely 3 widths, 20, 40, and 50 feet, with lengths in 10-foot increases. This uniform strategy meant supply commanders could determine transport needs accurately. A standard 40-foot flat car held one complete 40 by 20 package. Transport vessels designated cargo volume in Quonset unit measurements. Supply warehouses maintained replacement components, knowing that any 20-foot arch support matched any 20-foot hut, no matter when or where either was made. The arrangement prevented the adaptation that made Nissen huts versatile, but also made them inconsistent. Financial analysis showed where American engineering values separated from British practicality. In 1943, a complete 40 by 20 Quonset hut cost the Navy roughly $850, including all components, equipment, insulation, power parts, and flooring. A similar Nissen hut, according to British manufacturing data from 1918, cost roughly $230 in inflation-corrected 1943 money. The Quonset's better comfort and power arrangements validated the elevated price in American buying philosophy, but that 300% expense rise mattered significantly when calculating across thousands of units. The complete American spending on Quonset manufacturing surpassed $140 million by war's conclusion. Manufacturing quantity figures presented competing narratives about achievement. The United States built roughly 170,000 Quonset huts between 1941 and 1946, an average of 34,000 annually. Britain manufactured approximately 100,000 Nissen huts just during World War I between 1916 and 1918, averaging 50,000 yearly with considerably less industrial framework. The contrast wasn't production ability, it was design intricacy. Nissen huts demanded corrugated steel sheets, basic fastening hardware, and rough timber. Any metalworking operation could manufacture parts. Quonset huts required specialized steel shaping for the arch supports, exact die cutting for section attachment holes, and cooperation between insulation providers, power component builders, and timber operations. The engineering compromises became most apparent in flexibility. After original building, Quonset huts could be enhanced. Teams could add dividing walls, install climate systems, run extra power lines, and attach heavy machinery to the steel skeleton. These abilities made them appropriate for lasting setups like domestic training installations and support headquarters. Naval Air Station Alameda in California got over 400 Quonset huts in 1943 that operated as repair shops, training rooms, and management offices. Many stayed in operation until the installation shut in 1997, some for over 50 years. That durability confirmed the American strategy for setups where permanence weighed more than building velocity. But the skeleton that permitted these enhancements became a drawback in temporary field application. When the 43rd Infantry Division transferred from Guadalcanal to New Georgia in June 1943, they couldn't take apart and move their Quonset huts. The steel supports, once secured together, were challenging to disconnect without harming threads. The screwed-on sections could be detached, but without the skeleton, they were worthless. The complete camp framework, 42 Quonset huts, stayed behind, deserted. Nissen huts disassembled nearly as rapidly as they built because the fastened sections separated cleanly and could be reused somewhere else. British troops regularly moved Nissen camps, transferring the identical buildings from Egypt to Italy to Greece as battle lines changed. The actual separation between Nissen and Quonset histories emerged not during wartime, but in the decade following. When World War II concluded in August 1945, the United States military discovered itself with roughly 70,000 extra Quonset huts distributed across domestic installations that were quickly shutting. The War Assets Administration, responsible for selling military surplus, started offering complete Quonset huts to civilians in 1946 for prices between $200 and $600, depending on dimension and state. That same year, over 15,000 Quonsets were bought by farmers, small operations, and housing desperate families throughout America. The huts' integrated floors, insulation, and power arrangements made them instantly habitable as residences, repair shops, or storage structures. This civilian acceptance generated an American architectural occurrence that continued decades. Travel through rural Iowa, Kansas, or Nebraska today, and you'll still encounter Quonset huts functioning as equipment sheds and crop storage. Small airfields throughout the Midwest utilized them as aircraft shelters through the 1970s. The University of Illinois accommodated returning veterans in a Quonset community from 1946 until 1972, 260 huts, supplying temporary family accommodation that became semi-lasting because nothing substituted them. These buildings succeeded in civilian application exactly because of the characteristics that delayed their combat installation. The insulation maintained them comfortable throughout the year. The robust skeleton supported storage systems, equipment lifts, and alterations. The completed interiors accepted drywall and paint for those desiring traditional looks. Britain adopted the contrary strategy with Nissen huts after 1945. The military wanted them eliminated because they represented wartime scarcity. Thousands were taken apart, with the corrugated section sold as scrap during the post-war steel deficit. Some discovered civilian application. Farms in Yorkshire and Scotland transformed them to livestock barns and equipment storage. But the British administration actively prevented civilian keeping because they wanted to separate national character from wartime temporary construction. By 1955, most Nissen huts had disappeared from Britain, except on distant military grounds and farming properties where utility exceeded appearance. The handful of remaining examples today are either maintained as historical objects or concealed on private property where proprietors appreciate the waterproof storage more than looks. The architectural community regarded both designs with contempt that exposed class biases about temporary building. American architectural publications in the 1950s seldom referenced Quonset huts, except to criticize them as visual pollution. Frank Lloyd Wright supposedly labeled them metal livestock shelters unsuitable for human occupation. British architects were even more severe about Nissen huts, with one 1948 Royal Institute of British Architects document characterizing them as corrugated humiliations that should be removed from the landscape as rapidly as financially possible. This professional antagonism disregarded the functional truth that both designs had housed millions of individuals successfully and affordably when options didn't exist. Commonwealth countries created their own variations that frequently returned to Nissen concepts. Australia's post-war rebuilding featured simplified curved roof huts that removed American skeleton complication. These buildings, used for immigrant accommodation and distant framework through the 1960s, emphasized velocity and expense over comfort characteristics. Canada's Department of National Defense kept building Nissen pattern huts for northern installations where severe cold made insulated Quonsets impractical. The single-layer metal building prevented the disastrous ice accumulation that troubled Quonset roofs when snow weight surpassed design thresholds. The military ultimately advanced beyond both designs. By the Vietnam War period, the United States had created modular containerized accommodation that could be moved by helicopter and constructed even quicker than Nissen huts. These arrangements used aluminum skeletons and fabric sections weighing a portion of steel building. Contemporary military operations use expandable container shelters that install in hours. But these advanced solutions cost vastly more. A current military shelter arrangement costs $50,000 compared to the $850 a Quonset cost in 1943. When corrected for inflation, contemporary arrangements cost approximately 6 times more per square foot than their World War II ancestors, while delivering comparable utility. The core lesson contained in the Nissen versus Quonset narrative is that military supply operations don't always gain from engineering enhancement. Peter Nissen built his hut by posing one question: what's the absolute minimum required to keep soldiers dry and surviving? His response, curved corrugated metal fastened together, dismissed every traditional building concept. No bases, no skeletons, no trained labor needed, just metal sheets and fasteners. That merciless simplicity meant a sergeant and 5 depleted infantrymen could construct shelter in 72 hours while under artillery assault. The American engineers who planned the Quonset posed a separate question: how can we make this more convenient and lasting? Their response was objectively superior construction, but functionally inferior crisis shelter. This conflict between optimal and sufficient emerges throughout military chronicles. The M1 Garand rifle was better than the bolt-action Springfield in every quantifiable aspect, but it was also heavier, more intricate, and demanded more upkeep. Sherman tanks were mechanically dependable but under-armored compared to German Panthers. American troops prevailed with sufficient machinery deployed in massive quantities rather than flawless machinery deployed gradually. The Quonset followed this sequence. It was superior shelter than the Nissen, but military forces required shelter quicker than they required it superior. When the 1st Marine Division was battling in Guadalcanal mud during late 1942, having a waterproof building in 3 days would have mattered more than having an insulated, electrified building in 10 days. Contemporary military philosophy has mostly abandoned the velocity versus quality assessment that World War II demanded continuously. Current U.S. military building regulations presume framework will be established before significant troop installations, that supply routes will be protected, and that building can occur without enemy disruption. These presumptions proved accurate in Iraq and Afghanistan, where American troops dominated airspace and had months to construct forward operating installations. But they wouldn't prove accurate in peer confrontation situations where contested supply operations and quick position adjustments resemble World War II situations more than recent counterinsurgency missions. The Marine Corps acknowledged this shortfall in 2019 when they restarted Expeditionary Advanced Base missions, basically relearning the principle that velocity of installation matters more than convenience of structures. The engineering philosophy contrast reaches beyond just military uses. Contemporary building everywhere emphasizes intricacy over straightforwardness. Construction regulations demand power arrangements, insulation requirements, base guidelines, and numerous other characteristics that make buildings superior but slower and more costly to construct. This makes complete sense for lasting structures, but generates issues for crisis response. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, FEMA required instant shelter for thousands of relocated families. The temporary accommodation they offered, small manufactured residences, demanded concrete bases, utility connections, and took weeks to place per unit. Nissen-style buildings could have been built in days using only the devastated region's current framework, offering instant shelter while lasting reconstruction advanced. The 170,000 Quonset huts America manufactured represented authentic industrial accomplishment and offered shelter for millions of personnel throughout every region. They operated effectively in their designated function as semi-lasting base framework, but they couldn't equal what 6 British soldiers achieved in 1916, constructing waterproof shelter in 3 days with nothing but hand equipment and resolve. That ability, that velocity, that merciless simplicity was the genuine breakthrough. The Quonset enhanced everything about the Nissen except the single element that mattered most in war: getting soldiers out of the mud and into shelter before the following shelling began. The corrugated curved huts still existing across farmland and former military locations are memorials to contrasting philosophies. The remaining Quonsets demonstrate American engineering made them durable enough to exceed their planned function. The disappeared Nissen huts demonstrated British engineering made them straightforward enough that military forces could construct them anywhere, anytime, under any situations, and then deserted them without hesitation when the battle lines advanced. Both strategies functioned, but only one could be constructed while the artillery was still landing. And that's the contrast between architectural achievement and combat requirement.